Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Goldsmith. I'm an evolutionary neuroscientist, life sciences entrepreneur, and one of the Big Tent trustees. And I'm delighted tonight to introduce Jonathan Haidt. He's one of the greatest social scientists of our time. So the first half an hour or so, he's going to be in conversation with Rory Sutherland, another great friend of the Big Tent, an advisory board member, and a truly creative thinker. And then I'll open up the discussion more broadly. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Professor Haidt's work and his books, well, really, Christmas 2021 has come early for you. I mean, his book, The Happiness Hypothesis, is an absolute must-read, as is indeed The Righteous Mind, and most recently, The Coddling of the American Mind. And these are very relevant to Big Tent's aims because we're focused on regeneration and renewal, but not just of the physical, also of our social fabric. And barriers to renewal include polarized thinking and difficulties in being able to listen and appreciate differing views. Big Tent tries to overcome this by convening civil conversations to incubate cohesive regeneration projects. So Jonathan, Rory, and indeed all of our esteemed Big Tent friends who are attending this evening, we value enormously your insights and support. So thank you very, very much. And now if I can hand over the microphone to you, Rory.
Of course, what a huge pleasure this is. I have to just say very quickly that Jonathan Haidt's book, in particular, The Righteous Mind, which was the first one I read, was absolutely decisive in my thinking, not least in the central insight that actually a lot of the opinions we hold are rooted in evolutionary instincts, if you like, which are in many ways kind of unconsciously felt. And it partly explains, I suppose, first of all, that much of the language and the arguments we use to support our visceral emotional feelings are actually post-rationalized. They aren't the real reason we believe these things at all. We believe the reasons for reasons which are opaque to introspection. They may be involved, they may be the product of something else. And of course, it explains, as part of that, it explains why actually trying to change people's minds with facts is actually, in many ways, such an uphill struggle, that everybody is arguing through the pretense that, of course, their point of view is factually determined and factually informed. But the truth of the matter is that most of the kind of animus comes from somewhere else. There's a parallel I always give in advertising, which is why people think they clean their teeth and why they really clean their teeth. They have official reasons all to do with dental health and gum health and so on. But if you look at when people clean their teeth, which is before a date, almost certainly, okay? They clean their teeth first thing in the morning before they go to work. They probably clean their teeth before sex, but it depends how long they've been in that relationship. Actually, you realize that the real motivation for cleaning your teeth is to do with vanity and fear of bad breath. It's not really much to do with dental health. And that helps explain why 98% of the world's toothpaste is flavored with mint, which is a taste that actually about 40% of people really don't like very much. And so this idea, I think, is crucial because it explains why factual information is often far less persuasive than we think it should be. But Jonathan mentioned actually that towards the end of the 1990s, you had the end of the Soviet Union. And indeed, Francis Fukuyama wrote that book called, I think, The End of History, which he more or less asserted that, all of these kind of political polarizing battles had ended, that the world had arrived at a happy consensus that kind of liberal democracy was the only way forward, and that we could look forward to a kind of harmonious world. And yet, it really hasn't played out that way, has it? Now, I might argue, I'm just going to add one little point. To some extent, it has played out that way. And let me explain, because a lot of political division seems to me fundamentally rather pointless, by which I mean that if you ask people on the left, if they couldn't live in the UK or the US, which country would they live in? People on the left would be more likely to say Canada or Denmark or Sweden. And people on the right would probably be slightly more likely to say Australia or maybe, if you're pretty right wing, Texas, okay? But actually, the material differences between those places are more or less trivial. I mean, I could live in any of them perfectly happily, okay? Now, actually, in the 1970s, there were people who basically thought that all possessions should be nationalized and that everything should be apportioned by the state. There were serious political differences in terms of the kind of world you wanted to live in. You know, conservatives in the 1970s probably, if given the choice, would have gone back to the kind of 18th century. So there is a kind of consensus about the kind of country we want to live in, and yet politics has seemed to have polarized to an insane degree. What do you think is behind that contradiction?
Okay, well, was that your opening question, Rory?
Yeah. I mean, because Fukuyama, in a sense, it did play out because there is a consensus about what kind of country you want to live in, but it isn't as if there's been a kind of a kind of political. No political consensus has really emerged.
I got it. Okay, so first, before I answer the question, 2 comments. One, it is always so much fun to talk with Rory. I always learn something new from the way he draws from multiple perspectives. And in fact, I did actually brush my teeth just before coming here. Now, that tells us nothing about my desires for you, but it does say something about, self-presentation. Also, it's lunchtime here in the US, and I just had lunch. And the second thing is I love coming to the UK. I have always really liked Britain as an American. I'm Jewish, and my grandparents all came to this country. And I was surprised to find other Jews all over Latin America and other countries. And when I would talk with them, I realized, my God, thank God my grandparents came to a country that was settled by Britain with British institutions, and life is just so much better. So I've long felt a kinship with the UK. And as I've been traveling around the world to write, I'm working on a book on capitalism and morality, again, seeing the power of British institutions, and then seeing you go through the same kind of tortured division since 2016 that we've been going through. So in so many ways, and now that you're out of the EU, I've secretly been kind of hoping that we'll kind of form a commonwealth, and with Australia and Canada once again. Perhaps I would be, perhaps I've just betrayed the founding fathers of my country in saying that, but obviously our countries are twinned even more now than they were 10 or 20 years ago. So let's talk about, so it's a pleasure to have this conversation about what is going wrong with our countries. In the 1990s, we were riding high. I mean, Anglo-British capitalism was the most dynamic, and our economies were great, and all these countries were copying us. What went wrong? So I'm a social psychologist, and I look not just at individual cognition, but at systems and how they interact with individual cognition. And I like to tell the story of our insanity, our recent insanity. I think there's about 10 or 12 different threads, but there are 4 really big ones that I think are true in both our countries. So the first is keep your eye on affective polarization. So people use the word polarization. What does it mean? Some political scientists point out in America, our attitudes about abortion are not separating into 2 camps. Attitudes are not polarized, actually. What's polarizing is the degree to which we hate the other side. Until the 1990s, we didn't hate people in the other party. We had a slightly negative view of them, but we didn't hate them. And that was steady for the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, steady. And then suddenly in the late 90s, it starts going up. And then in the 2000s goes up even faster. So this is crucial because, as Rory said, I'm all about intuitions driving reasoning. And it's one thing if you kind of dislike Republicans, you can still talk with them. But if you really hate them, so in fact, there was just a case here. There was a mommy blogger, a woman who writes about mothering, an expert on sleep, and people would go to her with their sleep problems. Well, someone discovered she gave $1,000 to the Trump campaign in 2016. And now the big question is, can you take advice from an expert who gave to the Trump? 30 years ago, that would have been an absurd question, but now it's so tribal. It's like she suddenly is taboo, off limits, evil. So that's one, affective polarization. We have good data on that in the US. I actually haven't seen the data from the UK, but I don't know whether it's is it, Labour Tory, or is it all about Brexit? But my question to you, and just physically raise your hand if the answer is yes, is do you feel as though Britons dislike each other more intensely than they did 5 years ago, that there's just much more animosity. Just raise your hand if you say yes. Okay, and raise your hand if you say no. Okay, let me see, let me look, 1, 2, okay, so right, there is, so yeah, the majority says yes, but there are some who say no. I think we can say that your country is not as divided as the US, but I think you're on, this is a similar sort of path. Okay, that's the first point. Affective polarization. Okay, now the next point is the media ecosystem, changes in the media ecosystem. And this also largely explains the rise in affective polarization. So what we have to all realize is that the late 20th century was the aberration. We had really professional journalists. We had, you had the BBC, we had 3 television networks. So there was broadcasting, like literally broadcasting. Everybody had the same set of facts. And that was a brief period of our country's histories. Before then, all the newspapers were rags full of lies. And now, to some extent, the same. Well, but the late 20th century was the anomaly. Once we get cable TV, and then we get, in this country, Rush Limbaugh just died. He was the guy who really made right-wing talk radio into a partisan weapon. And then Fox News comes out. So actually, Rupert Murdoch plays a big role in why it's the Anglo countries that are getting more polarized, much more so than continental Europe. So Rupert Murdoch, and in our country, Fox News, really pushes the right to the right. So the Republicans really shift to the right beginning in the 90s. And many, including me, would say that they have now completely lost their minds, their hearts, their souls, their values, and any connection to Edmund Burke or conservatism. So the media, so before social media, cable TV and right-wing talk radio was already polarizing us. And then social media comes in and the left has now also polarized to some extent too. But I've been really focused on how social media has made things so much worse. And this is why the 2010s were so weird and bad for democracy. Social media comes out in 2003, 2004 with MySpace, Facebook, Friendster, but they were not polarizing. They were just, here's my page, here are the groups that I like, the bands I like, and here are my friends, not polarizing. In 2009, everything changes. And this is the story that everybody needs to understand because people don't seem to know this. In 2009, Facebook adds the like button and Twitter copies it. Twitter adds the retweet button and Facebook copies it. So in the space of 1 year, the feed used to be chronological. In the space of 1 year, the two companies have huge amounts of engagement data. What makes people click? What makes them forward? And then they have algorithms to feed people exactly what will most engage them, meaning enrage them. And so between 2009 and 2011, social media changes to become much more political, much less about what you had for lunch or what you did with your friend, much more political, much more enraging, much more engaging. And so people flood on between 2009 and 2011, they flood on. They now stop reading newspapers. So now the newspapers have to accommodate and they have to be more clickable and they have to link in with social media. So by 2013, we have what's called an outrage machine. Social media has become the most powerful means of generating outrage ever. And who notices this? The Russians. The Russians have been messing with our democracies for 50 years. Now they say, wow, thank you, Silicon Valley. We can save a lot of money on airfare. We don't have to send any agents to Ohio. We can just sit here in St. Petersburg and mess with your democracy. So in 2009 was the old world, everything that we all grew up knowing. Between 2009 and 2012 or 13, the basic fabric of social space-time changes. It just fundamentally changes, just as if the laws of gravity changed. And since 2014, everything has been weird. It first blew up on campuses in the US and right afterwards in the UK. Things got just totally weird on campus with its new weird moralities and constant calling out. And then that has now spread to so many industries. So that was the first two: affective polarization, and then the media ecosystem, especially social media. And I'll go much quicker through the next two, which are globalization, which has affected our countries in very much identical ways, which is that us people making our living as knowledge workers and symbol analysts who can work online, I mean, your country's much smaller. Maybe this isn't true for you, but people like me, I know London much better than I know almost any city in America, other than like San Francisco and Boston and Washington. So you get this sort of global elite that are, and really helpful here is David Goodhart's book. The road to somewhere. He contrasts anywheres like us, most of us, I should say, are anywheres, and then somewheres are rooted. They're more parochial. And there was a great phrase during the Brexit debate. There was some British analyst actually named Shakespeare. He said, "Are we a drawbridge up or a drawbridge down country?" And that's the heart of it. So you get so globalization reorients. It's the left-right dimension is no longer labor versus capital. It's the anywheres versus the somewheres, and that really the anywheres do these things that really enrage the somewheres and triggers right-wing populism. So we have this reorientation because of globalization. And then the last feature I want to mention, again, I'm sorry for going on so long, but I really feel like this is a complicated story and I need to just put it out there and then we'll talk about it. The last one is really bad elites. And what I mean by that is there are always elites. In both of our countries, especially yours, the elites were those who, because of heredity or wealth, they were the elites. And there was at least a sense of they were rooted, especially in your country, they were rooted in place. They were rooted in land and therefore ties to community. And so there was an intimate relationship between people and there was a sense of noblesse oblige. Now, maybe they behaved terribly overall, I don't know. But the point is there used to be an elite structure that was rooted and that there were, and that had certain ideas. And I think we pioneered the use of basically intelligence tests to admit to universities. Harvard began doing that in the 1950s. All other American universities followed suit. And so to get honor used to have all kinds of rich meanings. It doesn't anymore for most Americans. Honors means you got the highest grade. And so our new elite since the 60s, it began in the 60s, but it really was clear by the 90s. The new elite are the people who did best on the tests. The people who got the highest scores on the test, they go to the top schools, they get the top consulting jobs or medical school, or whatever it is. And so in both of our countries, the elites now are meritocratic winners. And if you're a meritocratic winner, you feel that you earned it. You don't owe it to anyone else. So the elites are not connected to people in the same way. Now they have all kinds of lovely Davos values, and they value, stakeholder capitalism and all sorts of things. But it's fundamentally different from the older elites. In the United States, at least, like the WASP elite, they would go into government service or the CIA or the military, and that's all changed now. So there are a lot of really interesting writers, Peter Turchin, Martin Gurry, who've been focusing on it's not just like, oh, those populists are so terrible and racist. It's like the non-elites are furious and the elites treat them with absolute contempt, and they really do. We really do treat them with contempt. And so, of course, they're revolting. And that was part of what was behind the attack on the US Capitol, although there's obviously a lot directly attributable to Donald Trump. So anyway, keep your eye on those four things: rising affective polarization, changes in the media ecosystem, globalization reorienting the sort of the left-right divide, and bad elites. All right, that's my story. I'd love to hear, well, actually, so first I'll talk with Rory and then we open it up to everybody. So Rory, critiques, does that work just as well in the UK? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly echoes. I mean, we've got to be very careful about always generalizing. For example, people always write about...
You should never always generalize.
No. So people always wrote about this sort of right-wing trend that was characterized by the election of Thatcher and Reagan, as though this was some coordinated thing. Whereas in fact, let's be honest, Thatcher was a better candidate than James Callaghan and Reagan was a better candidate than Jimmy Carter. So, I think one of the problems actually with elite education is it probably selects for people who are a bit overactive at pattern recognition and are overly keen on cramming everything into one theory of the world, which is because one of the questions I was going to ask is that the problem undoubtedly exists. Well, this is why I raised my hand hesitantly, which is, yes, there is certainly the impression of vastly greater polarization. It seems to be much more an urban than a rural or suburban phenomenon. It's much more a university phenomenon than it is a phenomenon, say, in the workplace, to be absolutely honest. I was talking to someone actually who just moved out using the COVID as an excuse to relocate. And he'd moved from New York to Bozeman, Montana. And the first thing that struck him as completely bizarre as a New Yorker, and I had a similar experience when I moved out of London actually, was that in Bozeman, Montana, which as you can imagine is a blue town in the middle of a red state, okay,
It's university,
like Austin, Texas, and so forth,
Yeah.
okay. The local shop is a co-op, which is a bit like Whole Foods, run by 3 transsexual hippies. And the clientele of the local shop basically turn up in pickup trucks with guns on their belts. And the 2 groups of people get on absolutely fine. There's utterly no issue at all. And so there is a very urban thing, which is, first of all, you get groups of people of exactly the same age, all essentially, what is it, homophily it's called, isn't it?
Yeah.
All socializing together. And it does seem to be a problem that manifests itself where you get concentration of, very, very similar people. And that's, I think, known with polarization, isn't it? That when you concentrate people, they tend to become more extreme to signal their group affiliation.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. So no, I think that observation is correct. But it's not just that it's an urban thing. I think what we have to do is we have to look at the illiberalism on both sides and then see how it manifests. So we've had extraordinary displays of right-wing illiberalism throughout Europe and America, on the rise of right-wing and even political parties and leaders with ties to neo-Nazis. So the sort of the far right or the populist right, and often drawing inspiration from Friedrich Nietzsche, and strength makes right. So there's a fantastic poll done by a British company, the More in Common, and they did this great hidden tribe study. They've done work on the UK as well. So that far right group, that's about 7 or 8% of the country. They call them the devoted conservatives, and they're often authoritarians. 7 or 8%, and they have no cultural visibility except when they stormed the Capitol. But other than that, I've never met them. So that's but that group. And then the larger group of Trump supporters, which that's the core, they have a lot of influence on the Republican Party. But other than that, you don't really see them. Now, on the far left, we have the woke, the elect, as John McWhorter now calls them, the people who are engaging in performative progressivism in a kind of a religious way. And the More in Common study says they're also about 7%. But where are they? They're all around us. So I'm in a university. It's probably 20 or 30% in the university. We hear from journalists, so the New York Times is having all kinds of convulsions because the young woke journalists do not believe in getting both sides of a story. Why should we give a platform to the bad side? So I do agree with you, Rory, that these concentrations in New York, London, San Francisco, and Boston, Cambridge, yes, it's really intense there. And if you go to Bozeman or almost anywhere else, people have a much more a live and let live attitude, because the woke left does not have a live and let live attitude. Now, of course, the small fascist right doesn't either, but we don't encounter them. What do you think about that?
No, I mean, Burke made that comment, didn't he, about the grasshoppers versus the cattle? Which is that
I don't know that comment.
It's some fantastic quote about, that all around the field there are, majestic cattle, but the grasshoppers make all the noise. And if you think about it, the woke left have an extraordinary kind of noise-making capacity. Because they tend
the cattle
to be heavily...
are very afraid of them.
Yeah. So you must have, you had the extraordinary incident. A couple of extraordinary incidents. One of them was, which baffled even pretty woke British people, which is someone in an elevator. You probably heard this. Someone in an elevator in a conference who said,
"Yes, ladies lingerie,
right?"
Yes.
And was asked to apologise for causing offence.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
Now, sometimes one of the things that's irritating being British, by the way, is that we use the same language, but we don't always use it in the same way. And this is just a dad joke. It's a trope, because in Britain, unlike the US, you rarely came across elevators except in department stores. So whenever you're in an elevator, the joke was to pretend you're in a department store. And it's a very old joke. And no one British, I think, would have been offended by this for a moment. Okay. And so sometimes there are cases where the only time I got into trouble in Twitter is I'm half Welsh, and I made a joke. The Welsh, strangely, although they're accused of having sex with sheep, they tend to they tend to respond in a very clever, oblique way by regarding it as a badge of honor. Okay, right? So you make no pretense to deny it, you see. And I made some sort of joke, being half Welsh, about, very pretty picture of a sheep. And I said, Welsh Tinder is just getting better by the day. This guy the guy from the States came in and was absolutely livid. Yeah. And I was being lectured, in a sense, in the same way that, admittedly, the British guy was in the United States. And I wanted to make the point for these people who'd got very angry with the man saying ladies' lingerie, which is, they claimed that he had sexualized the conversation and made her feel unsafe. Well, if you're British and you work for Ogilvy, the ad agency, you will regularly, as it happened to me, have Americans standing up and saying, I remember David standing there in his red suspenders and saying, okay, now, David wore red braces, what we call braces, okay, just to be clear to the British audience. And, most Brits who heard that sentence had to spend the next 50 minutes trying to get the image out of their head. And so there can sometimes be a case in the UK where you feel you're being policed by people who don't fully understand the context. That's one weird phenomenon which happens, I think. And there are a few other cases. I mean, the case with Nicholas Christakis at Yale was particularly bizarre, wasn't it?
That's right.
Because I know Nicholas, and he would be a contender for the world's most urbane man award. He spent years, I think, working in a very poor area of Chicago as a doctor.
Yeah.
Okay. Yet none of that counts for anything if you say anything that's just slightly, which goes slightly against what you might call the prevailing accepted mode of speech.
Right. Okay. So actually, that is a great point, and that allows me to bring in like the best distinction, the most helpful distinction that I just found 2 or 3 days ago in an article in The Guardian. It was called "How to Have Better Arguments Online" by Leslie. What was his name?
I know him. Yeah, Ian Leslie.
Ian Leslie. Very good.
Yeah.
So here's the key thing. This was just brilliant. It's great, the cultural interchange here. He writes about the American anthropologist Edward Hall introduced the distinction between two types of communication culture: high context and low context. And this always struck me about Britain in particular, is that the British sense of humor is so much better, in part because there's just like this whole web of common associations, and there's a much richer game going on with language. Whereas in America, because we don't have that, we're so big and diverse and new that you have to, what you say has to be in the message. You can't assume a whole bunch of context. And so Hall introduced this distinction, and Ian Leslie points out that, so in a low culture context, communication is explicit and direct. What people say is taken to be an expression of their thoughts and feelings. You don't need to understand the context, who is speaking. But of course, technology has put us in massive constant interaction with strangers. And many of those strangers are looking to find a thing that they can get outraged about to broadcast what team they're on and how good their values are. So you take human beings who naturally think in context and speak in context, you put them on a platform that restricts, especially on Twitter, restricts context to a tiny, the communication to a tiny amount with no assumption of context, but people still often foolishly think that people will understand that they meant it as a joke, or they foolishly think that, well, it's clear that my intention is good here. I'm trying to be helpful. But of course, that doesn't matter. Intention doesn't matter. And so this might be especially painful for Brits because you're used to assuming context, but now in the social media world, boom, zero context. Everything you say will be interpreted in the worst possible way. And you don't get a chance to defend yourself because you can't reach the people that your critics have reached.
No, I think that's really critical. I mean, I can't remember, there was an American humorist who always suggested there should be a form of type which is the opposite of italics, which slopes the opposite way, called ironics, which you use when you're actually not being deadly serious.
That is great.
Which H.L. Mencken, that was the guy who's probably actually his statues are probably busy being demolished because he was a bit dodgy back in the day. Yeah. But I mean, also, of course, judging people of the past by the context of the present is a bit weird.
No, that's right. No context, just performance in the here and now.
So you're right about British English is very high context. I mean, one of the most common things is a kind of, it's almost like aposematic signaling in animals where you're very rude to people you like. for instance.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Do you call it taking the piss out of someone?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
all these
So
expressions,
you deliberately, it's a bit like tickling. So you effectively say things to people which you could only get away with saying to someone who is a friend. There's a lovely thing about social media too, I can tell you, which goes back to Dr. Johnson. And the reason is, and they only know this because of, I think, Boswell's Life of Johnson. And if you think about it, London was about the first city in the modern world, certainly in the West, to hit a population of 1 million. So you suddenly had complete anonymity. You'd meet people in London and never expect to meet them again. And on the riverboats, as you went along the river, the tradition arose where everybody just shouted abuse at people on the bank. And people on the bank shouted abuse at people in the boats. Because it was
playful, right? It was playful, it was a series.
Yeah, well, the point was, I think, it was the first case in human history where you could be rude to people without a risk of getting hit.
Oh, interesting.
If you think about it, because you could suddenly be rude with complete impunity. You're never going to see, you couldn't do that in a town of 5,000 people because you get, the 18th century equivalent of your tires slashed.
Yeah.
But they suddenly realized that people are as rude as they can get away with. And of course, on Twitter, many of the people don't even really reveal their identity.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And so that, I mean, but I do think actually the press is more guilty in some respects than social media because it thrives on, first of all, the typical rolling news program in both the US and in Sky News in the UK is 30 minutes of isn't the government terrible, followed by 30 minutes of isn't populism awful. And you can't help feeling that the first 30 minutes might contribute to the second to some degree in the negativity of the press. And actually a kind of willful lack of sort of patriotism or optimism can't really help here. And you're probably right that Murdoch was the first to master, well, I mean, the 19th century journalism would have been rich in that kind of thing. But he was the first person to reintroduce that kind of combative stuff. But equally, do you think it's fair also to say that the press is in thrall to, in the US, I always thought that if Nixon had been a Democrat, he would have got away with it, I have to admit. Kennedy got away with things which, had he been a Republican, let's face it, might have been revealed a bit sooner. Do you think the press is left-wing biased, or is it just anywhere metropolitan biased?
No, I think the press is almost always going to be left-wing biased. Creative industries, writers, artists are always going to attract people with a more, so the left-leaning disposition is higher on openness to experience, love of diversity and travel, wanting to figure things out in order to change them. So progressives want progress. Social activists, journalists are going to generally attract people from the left, whereas the police, the military, things that focus on order and rules are going to attract people from the right. So if there was no discrimination and no hostile workplace, you'd still see that. But now there is, if not discrimination, there's clearly hostile workplace towards people who are not that. So it gets much more concentrated. And that has, with this affective polarization. So this is the big thing in the New York Times now, is, some people say that the real editors of the New York Times is Twitter, because they're so afraid, the editors there are so afraid of publishing something that will cause outrage, not just because they're afraid of Twitter, but because they're afraid of especially their younger, woker staffers. So, so journalism plays a big role in this, and it does become a kind of a mutually reinforcing cycle of extremity. We're going through a period of purification.
I'm going to go open up for questions in just a second. The only other thing I was going to add is that not only
Rory, we've got some great questions.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, let's go.
And I want to begin. Actually, Tom Hashmi, if you're still online, if you can unmute yourself for your question, and the backdrop to it really is. That, Jonathan, you've described, I think, sort of 4 things which could be regarded as proximate causes for our current problems. But really, sort of what are the underlying evolutionary sort of biology things which cause this mismatch between our brains, the way our emotions work, and the society in which we currently find ourselves in. So Tom, are you there?
Yes, I do have baby and iPad, so forgive background noise. Okay. My question is, what was the question? What is social distrust useful for?
Well, social distrust. So, I hate it when people say that something is hardwired, like humans are hardwired to do something or the other. humans are predisposed to all sorts of things, and we have all sorts of systems that are contingent, that give a different result based on context. And so for most of our evolutionary history, as Homo sapiens, the most dangerous creatures weren't lions and tigers and bears. It was other groups of humans also having weapons and also wanting the same territory and the same resources and fighting over women. And so the death rates in hunter-gatherer groups, especially if they're on plains or in areas that are not like islands, the death rates are extremely high from male-on-male murder and war and conflict. So we have all these tribal instincts, but another remarkable feature of hunter-gatherers, or almost every society before contact with European societies, was that they have really long-distance trade networks. Of course, they have to exchange with other groups because they have to exchange. Typically, they'll exchange daughters, sometimes sons, but usually daughters. You have to do that to avoid inbreeding. So we're really contingent. That is, we're kind of wary of strangers, but we're also interested in them. And so you have to, be careful, but then you have to have ways of developing trust. And that's why there are all kinds of peace rituals and all sorts of things that groups do. And you see this in groups of kids playing on playgrounds too. Does that answer your question, or were you after something different?
I suppose that speaks to why we've had it in the past, but what's its use today? Like what could be the positives of the levels of affective polarization in modern society?
Oh, I see. Yeah. I think there are a lot of things where the balance was kind of tuned up over the 100 or 200,000 years or longer of human or hominid evolution. And now that we're able to, and this is the great thing about the Enlightenment and the liberal tradition in Europe, was that it developed institutions that can take care of a lot of these things. You can outsource a lot of the culture of honor stuff to the courts or the laws or constables on patrol. Now, obviously, in China they had a different form of social structure. In India, so there's civilization, but whenever you get civilization, you get and they're all, civilizations are only 5 to 10,000 years old, depending on how you want to count it. So I would agree with the thrust of your question that we are set for our settings for social distrust are too high for the way we live now. The dangers are not so great. But this is, again, drawbridge up or drawbridge down. Okay, so here's an example. So in America, the left loves to praise Scandinavia. We think that they have the best governments, the best systems. And of course, they have right-wing populism there. They have the same debate that you have. What do we do about immigrants? And there's a really brilliant Swedish historian, I'm blocking on his name now, but I'll come up with it in a moment, who notes that our generous welfare states only work if there is a social contract between those who are in with each other. And it doesn't work if we open or not, if we think of ourselves as globalists and we care as much about people in poor countries as we do our own citizens. We can't have this welfare state. And so the left-right battle in all of our countries, I would say, is between those who are saying, drawbridge down, knock down all the walls. John Lennon, if there were no nations and no religions, just all the people living life in peace. That's what we need to do. And so if we were set for that, I would say all of your welfare states would fall apart very quickly. And in general, our countries wouldn't work. So I think you do need a conservative element. I recently heard a lecture, all the talk about authoritarianism is not quite, the name isn't quite right. A better word, John Hibbing said, is securitarianism. So these people on the right, they're not necessarily that they want a fascist leader, but they are really about security, protection, borders from outside threats, terrorists, disease, that sort of stuff.
Great. Now, we've got 3 questions which are sort of interconnected. The first one from Michael Holland, which is a general one in terms of, okay, you've told us about all of the problems, how do we make things better? And then Dolly, if you were able to unmute, Dolly Teus, and then Mark Essex, because you've got slightly different questions, one Dolly on people and one Mark on rules to try and affect that. So Dolly first.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Hello, Dolly.
Hi, and thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating. I've been so looking forward to this event, and well done, Big Tent, for an amazing turnout as well. My question was related to the kind of people that politics rewards and recognizes and attracts, therefore. And I put it quite simply in the way I wrote the question, but realizing it's sort of much bigger than that. But it attracts sort of typically an extrovert character that's able to communicate, and particularly with social media, the reward system rewards very short sound bites, and we know that we're moving towards that. So how, again, moving forward, could we create a politics that not only recognizes different communication styles, different learning styles, different personality types, but actually can create different spaces in which those can all thrive? So if people are not comfortable extroverts, their value as communicators in just different ways can be rewarded and facilitated.
Okay, great. So let me answer that one. I've actually already forgotten what the first one was before.
Well, the first one was a general question: how do we make things better? So then
okay, good. So we can do these together. Yeah.
And then Mark Essex, maybe if you can just put your
go ahead.
Or John answers everything.
Yeah. So my question is about the rules of the game. I think when we see the EU using kind of tactics around sort of throwing shade at a debate rather than interrogating facts, and the EU Commission, the most rules-based organization I can think of, or certainly that would see itself that way, on the vaccine contract, published the contract and still try to sort of argue their position when it's pretty clear, I think, to most of us. You start to think there's no hope to persuade the players. Right? If an organization like that is using those tactics to basically survive a 4-minute interview, to escape scrutiny because there's no truth anymore, we've got to change the rules, not the players. And what will it take if the like button and retweet was a rule change that sparked all of this? The optimist in me says, surely better minds than me can think of the rule change that undoes it. I suggested the ignore button, but I'm open to suggest. Is there a magic bullet?
Well, without having to think about it, I can tell you there's no magic bullet, but there are because there are many factors that are interacting. If you think about a dynamical system, dynamical systems are these have all kinds of complex feedback mechanisms, and a variety of things can change, but yet nothing changes visibly. And then all of a sudden you reach a point at which things reconfigure, you get massive change. That's what we saw with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of all of those countries so quickly, because nobody really believed in them or liked them. Let me start with Dolly's question first. So what kind of people are attracted to politics? First, as I understand it, there's a huge gender difference. So women tend to get into politics because they cared about an issue, they got involved on the local school board, and then they just ended up kind of rising up. And women, and again, take an evolutionary view, women are not as after fame and publicity, because that tends to raise a male's value, not a female's value, whether you buy that or not. The reasons why men and women get into politics are really different. For men, there's much more of a concern about, look at me, desire for greatness, competition. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, well, yes, electoral politics does reward. I would agree, it rewards extroverts, and the U.S. congressmen I've met have all been incredibly socially skilled and mostly very warm. And the shame is that our current political system does not allow them to use their political skills with each other. They don't even meet each other anymore. They ride separate trolleys under the Capitol. It's crazy. So we need to get politics working. I don't think it's that we need to attract better people. David Brooks has said that the quality of people going to Congress now is so much higher than it was 50 years ago. They're smarter, they drink less, they don't molest women as much. They're better people, but the system makes it so much harder for them to be effective. So I would look at, the answer to your question, I think, would be, we have to look not so much at who we attract, but at the rules of the game, to get to Mark's point, the rules of the game that end up bringing certain people in and affecting what they do and say. So here's the biggest single problem, closest thing to a silver bullet in the US, and then you tell me if this would work in the UK. Our biggest problem is we've got two parties, and most of the states have closed party primaries. So in all these red states, the general election is irrelevant because the Republican is going to win. So all that matters is the primary. And so it's not just that we select more extreme people on the right and the left, But once they're in Congress, they're still mostly reasonable, except in the last election. Now we have some real crazies. But most of the congressmen on both sides are very reasonable people, but they can't act reasonably. Because if they do, they're going to get primaried, we call it. They'll get challenged in the primary. There was just a case, Rand Paul, a very well-known, sort of libertarian Republican, he was being pressed on a talk show, can you agree that the election wasn't stolen? And he wouldn't agree that it wasn't stolen. And then 2 hours later, he was on Twitter saying, they tried to bully me, but look, I stood up to them. So when he was in that interview, he was thinking about Twitter. So we have to change the constraints acting on our politicians, because behind closed doors and without that fear of social media, they're actually really skilled, smart people who care about the country. Now, you tell me, would that work in the UK? Do you have an issue of like primaries? I know you have a very different system of selecting MPs.
I cannot tell you how much we have been talking about this and trying to change it. The processes behind politics, and that is such an under-discussed concept and focus for a lot of people. And I absolutely cannot tell you how much my question was poorly phrased and not accounting for that being a critical part, because the processes can affect how people behave, even if they, as you say, are high quality. It can constrain that coming out, and that's part of the problem. Is the selection processes for candidates is often assumed to be much more linear and rational and stage-based and all of these things than it actually is. It's much more informal, and again, that can reward and bring out certain characteristics and types. And so, absolutely cannot agree more that the processes themselves need addressing to identify what it is that we want to bring out.
Yeah. So to the answer to the first question of how to make things better, of course, all of us as individuals can do a lot in our personal relationships, but the real heavy lifting is going to be system changes to social media, more traditional media, which is hard in both of our countries, especially mine because of the First Amendment. And then the system changes of politics, elections, and actual parliamentary or congressional. So that's where the heavy lifting will be. Now, just to address Mark's question, additionally, you point out that these politicians are talking in ways, it seems like, how can they persuade each other? First, even when regular people talk, the goal isn't necessarily persuasion. We've always lived in groups. There weren't really private conversations until maybe the 18th or 19th century, and people had more privacy. So talk is always done in a social context, and we often care more about the audience than we do about the person we're talking to. So that's true for normal people. Politicians doing political talk, it's even more true. I mean, the idea, that we call the press secretary here is the spokesman for the president. What do you call it in UK? Okay, well, whatever you call it, the person,
that spin doctor.
The spin doctor. Yeah. So, that person is speaking, but there's no chance that a journalist asking questions is going to change that person's mind, because that's not what this engagement is about. So, Mark, if you're concerned that the EU throws shade rather than giving reasons, that's just the way things are. What you want to think about is, how can we get organizations or countries working better together so that better outcomes result? And the spinning, the publicity, that stuff, that's ephemeral. That's like the shadows in Plato's cave. We've got to so doing things more privately, or whatever the solution is, change the rules of the game to get better public policy, and then don't worry so much about the things people are saying publicly.
Great. We've got two questions. First from Robert Henderson, and then from Philip Blackwell, if you can get ready to unmute yourself, around whether, I suppose, there is hope looking at evolutionary principles again for the future. So Robert, are you there?
Hello, yes, yeah. So my question was just pretty simple. What gives you hope during these sort of polarized, troubled times? I was at Yale as an undergrad, actually. Rory,
I've read your work. I've read your essays about that. They're wonderful.
Thank you. And so I saw what happened at Yale with the campus eruptions, and then now I'm here at the University of Cambridge, and within a matter of months, I saw Jordan Peterson deplatformed. Was it a postdoc here? Was fired shortly thereafter. Noah Carl, and then I just heard the economic historian Gregory Clark was deplatformed.
Oh no, Gregory Clark!
I love
him. What was his crime?
I think he was going to give a talk on an upcoming book of his, something to do with the genetics of social class or something along those lines.
Ooh, yeah.
And
okay.
So I keep hearing more and more of these stories from friends of mine from the media and so on. And what gives you hope, or is there any hope that
Yeah.
things might, the trend might change?
Yeah.
Well, before you answer that, because that's sort of, do you have hope? But then Philip is going to ask about pace of change.
Do you want me to ask my question?
Yes.
Yeah, I think my question was principally, how do you judge when it's better to allow change through evolution, and when is it necessary to speed up the process and bring about rapid change, i.e. revolution?
Well, so this is, it's funny, I was just on a talk earlier and I read a wonderful quote from Edmund Burke contrasting Britain and France. How I should find it because it's such a wonderful quote. Let's see. Okay, you know what? I'm going to try to talk while I find the quote. I think I can do this. So what gives me hope? In the short run, not much. There are so many trends all pushing in the same direction, all leading to fragmentation and separation, and I expect many of them to continue getting worse. So in the short run, you know, I don't see many hopeful trends. But what gives me hope is that in the long run, things almost always get better, and in the long run, people have always looked at their age, almost always looked at their age and thought things are going to hell, things are getting worse. But yet, decade by decade, things get better. Prosperity, health, education, women's health and education, civil rights, gay rights. You know, the progress of history is actually quite extraordinary in a direction that progressives in particular should be quite pleased about. And from reading books by Steven Pinker and Matt Ridley, you know, you really see that, okay, look, people are always pessimistic, but yet things are always getting better, in part because humans are amazingly inventive. And the more there's a problem, the more people work on it. And then we usually find solutions. So one way to think about it is this. Every technology has had disruptive effects. And, you know, I'm sort of thin on history here, but people often seem to say like, well, the printing press, you know, when that came out, that was like 200 or 300 years of war in Europe erupted because, you know, somehow because of the printing press. When change happens slowly, we can adapt to it generation by generation. But when it happens really fast, as has happened with the digital revolution and the rise of social media, it's much harder. So my hope here is that you know, it's as though we went from horses to very fast cars in the space of 3 years without inventing traffic signs, traffic signals, or laws. And people are racing around in their fast cars, and you know, a lot of people are getting killed. But we're gradually coming to realize, okay, you know what? We need stop signs, and we need actually inspections of the cars, and we need to have them registered. So the hopeful thing is that we got complacent about democracy, and we got complacent about technology. Oh, just, you know, let them innovate, you know, and this is very much the American ethos is, you know, we're not going to have government control unless there's a real reason for it. And even then we're going to wait 30 years. So, so the hope is that in the beginning of the social media age, we're seeing huge downsides, and we're seeing some upsides too, but we're seeing huge downsides. And human inventiveness being what it is, we're likely to find solutions. Now, in social media, there's all kinds of market problems and restrictions on what government can do in the US, especially, not so much in the EU. So, you know, there may be some reason that we can't figure it out, but probably we will.
Great. Now there's two questions that, again, they're sort of balancing each other. So I'm going to ask Amir Sada, then Rebecca Myers to pose their question. So Amir, first of all.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. John, quick question for you. Obviously, you mentioned that, you know, you believe that things could potentially get worse from here, given the massive polarization that we're seeing, particularly in the United States. And I guess I'm interested to find out, and we've seen, obviously, you know, some social unrest, albeit quite seriously, but do you think that this could really escalate, where, you know, you may start seeing rebellions from, you know, the Midwestern states of the United States, and things just getting much worse from here? I mean, just today, I saw a post by, you know, Donald Trump Jr. It looked like he was filming it, you know, sitting in a bunker, where his backdrop was like an arsenal of weapons, you know, and maybe because we're here in England and we're not kind of used to that kind of thing. But I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that, on whether you think that this could really, you know, brew up into something quite serious.
Yes, we can talk about trends and averages, and on average, Matt Ridley and Steve Pinker are right, and the best prediction would be that things will get better. But there are black swan events. There are things that can happen that can really change the course of history. One assassination in Serbia, was it? Led to World War I, which historians say didn't have to happen. And similarly here, if it was really just a small fringe of people in the United States, we've always had a sort of a crazy, right-wing populist, the John Birch Society, conspiracy theories, but they've always been a small number of people, in the Mountain West or out West. Now what's clear, and this surprised me, it surprised me how many people believe that the U.S. election was stolen. That it's not just because I'd always been saying there's the authoritarian fringe of the Republican Party, but most Republicans are Burkean conservatives or perfectly reasonable, and I've been surprised that the great majority of Republicans believe the election was stolen, and they believe that it was Antifa who smashed the windows in the Capitol. It wasn't us good, Trumpians. And so if you have these mass beliefs, and especially because the right is, they say that it's America first, and they love the Constitution, they say. Well, if they literally believe that the election was stolen, then they literally believe that they are defending the Constitution by resisting. And if it comes to having to defend freedom with weapons, well, that's the most American thing there is. So it is possible, given how many guns there are in the hands of these people, we could see a big increase in right-wing violence. If it's just lone wolves here and there who will shoot up a black church, that's horrific, but that's not gonna lead to a civil war. But if it is constant movements of coordinated violent men, God knows what'll happen.
Got a brilliant question from George Freeman. George.
Thanks, Paul. John, I'm sorry I wasn't here at the beginning. We started Big Tent 4 years ago, as an antidote to the appalling breakdown of what we used to pride ourselves on as having sort of polite political discourse. And it's just a joy to have you with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my question is kind of whether you think, or whether there is any evidence for the demoralizing effect of powerlessness. And I ask that because it's sort of been a sort of deep belief in me from somewhere in childhood that taking responsibility was a good thing, and being responsible is a good thing. Mm-hmm. And I've sort of observed through life that when one is most powerless, they tend to be most depressed. Mm-hmm. And when you're least able to change your own conditions, you feel least able to help anyone else either.
Yep.
And so it feels to me as though there's a sort of fundamental building block of sort of civic virtue, that if we can give people enough responsibility, not too much or too little, but enough, that's difficult, then we will also add to some value of moral capital. I mean, yes. Demoralization goes both ways, right? Morale and moral are not dissimilar. And it feels to me as though some of what's happened in the West, certainly in this country, is a lot of people have felt very demoralized.
Yes.
And some quite dangerous politicians have used that for their own ends. And those of us in politics trying to resolve this, seems to me we've got to deal with the underlying causes of that breakdown, to put the tiger back in the cage and deal with the underlying causes. And I'd love any insights you could bring to that.
Yes, no, that's a great question. I'm very happy to draw from various parts of psychology to offer an answer. And I think it would be a similar response in both of our countries. So first, what you described is literally the theory of learned helplessness as studied by Martin Seligman, that when you put a mouse or a rat in a tank of water, and they can, you put them in a situation where they either can or cannot escape from a noxious stimuli, like a mild electric shock. Those that were able to escape from it, you then put them in a pool of water, and they search around, they find a submerged stair, and they escape. Whereas those who learned that nothing they did mattered don't even try in this new context. They don't try to find an escape. They just kind of sit there until they sink and die. So I think there's little question that making people feel powerless is demoralizing. Now, of course, that also could be harnessed. I mean, they can then be energized by someone who promises them power. But overall, I agree with where you're going with that. Now, you're a Tory, I'm guessing, rather than Labour, or what party are you?
Well, many people know I'm a Tory, but I view parties as very broad churches. I could say more, but I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Okay. All right. Now, so the reason why I thought that is because, so at first I thought, oh, it sounds like he's on the left, like, oh, people are disempowered. Power to the people. That would be the left answer, because, the rich people and the corporations are oppressing us, and we've, people power. We've got to overthrow those tyrants. So that would be the left. The right, the social right, the Burkean right, is more along the lines that if you give people responsibility, you'll energize them, and then they'll clean up their own backyards. I read something in The Guardian years ago, or some conservative politician talking about how, in some council flats, people don't bother cleaning up their own backyards because the government's supposed to do that. And so I think that is a valid conservative insight, that when people, when people can see the results of their work, you give them some authority over something, you bring out the best in them, they'll be energized, all of that. Now, that can sometimes be used to say, therefore, government should stop doing things, people should fend for themselves. So that's the legitimate left-right debate over that. But I think the real implication here, or one of the implications here, is that there are certain ideologies that are disempowering, and we're wrestling with this now in the U.S., where we've had the last 50 years has been the most extraordinary period in human history of decreasing racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, everything. Incredible progress. Yet we have the rise of doctrines that tell people that America is and was always a white supremacist nation, that 1619 slavery, that's what defines America. It's always there, it's baked in, it will always be there, no matter how you think whether you feel welcomed at Harvard or Yale, the whole place is against you. And this seems to be disempowering. It doesn't seem like a good way to actually help people succeed. So there are a lot of implications. Power and disempowerment are very important variables here, and left and right will use them in different ways, and both sides have some truth to them, I would say.
Rebecca Myers, are you still online, able to ask your question?
No, I'm still here.
Builds on that.
Yes, I suppose what I was interested in is, the underlying theories around how we change, and being influenced by systems thinking, which suggests, which we draw from the natural sciences, that we can predict and control outcomes, and how much that dominates people's thinking. Whereas actually, what we're constantly doing as social animals is renegotiating all the time with those around us in terms of what meanings we make of things. So I'm interested in how much you think that dominant ideology of systems thinking creates some of these difficulties that we're experiencing.
Yes, I fully agree with that. That, as I said earlier, our societies are complex dynamical systems, and our educated class, the political scientists and the policy people, are mostly high systemizers, to use Simon Baron-Cohen's terms, who will give us simple models, like they gave us simple models in the 50s and 60s of rational choice. And in both of our countries, public policy is the most influential people are the economists. And that's the field in the social sciences that has the most Asperger's or autism or high systemized thinking people. And so they would come up with simple things, like here, well, if we change this incentive, that should have this effect. And, a terrible one in the United States was in the early 90s, the economists said, well, we need to, they suggested, let's say that companies can no longer deduct the pay that they give their chief executives over $1 million. They can't deduct that unless they have a pay for performance scheme. Let's make sure that CEOs are incentivized to increase the value of the company. Okay, so they did that. Well, what happens? Since the 90s, American capitalism has been largely about CEOs are so incentivized to increase the stock price, come hell or high water, regardless of what it does to anybody. So it was a disaster, and it gave us this much more exploitative form of capitalism. So if that's the kind of thinking you mean by systems thinking, I fully agree. It's not appropriate. It's not adequate for our complex societies. But when you said we renegotiate in terms of meanings, yes, we're doing that constantly. So I would say I would think of it as a kind of systems thinking, although not like the linear, if you systems thinking about complex dynamical systems, you'd say people are renegotiating. Where does that take place? Under what conditions do those negotiations go well and create value for everybody? And under what conditions does it become just public display where people are getting likes and followers and the negotiations fall apart? So that's why I would say that social media is largely destructive. If that's your view of society, of people coming together to talk, social media has been a disaster. And what we need is ways to prioritize private conversations where nobody judges. And of course, technology can do that, but Twitter and Facebook don't.
Fantastic. Joe Zamit Lucia. In fact, you've got sort of two questions you've raised. One around what we can learn from the Dutch approach, and the second one around left-right thinking. Does it sort of still stand?
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I mean, I live in the Netherlands, and here they have centuries of tradition of a consensus culture.
Yes.
Which is very different from this kind of Anglo-Saxon robust debate type of approach. Mm-hmm. And each has its advantages and disadvantages. But one thing that forces a consensus culture is a system of total proportional representation, mm-hmm. because no single political force is ever in absolute power. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to see that the idea of proportional representation for the UK has been spreading, and I believe is now even part of Labour Party policy. So I'm wondering, you said earlier it's the system that forces a particular way of behaviour, and the electoral system, I think, has an impact on whether things are polarised or more consensual. The other question I have is, we all keep talking about this traditional right-left thinking, mm-hmm. and I'm not sure that that's appropriate anymore. It seems to me that, the values that were previously embodied in the right and previously embodied in the left are all kind of mixed up now, and the kind of old-fashioned, as I see it, traditional trying to put people in right or left boxes really is no longer applicable, because people behave and vote and feel they belong somewhere on a multiplicity of things that don't no longer, in my view, fit into the traditional mm-hmm. kind of caricatures of right and left.
Yes. Okay. Right. Two good questions. So briefly on the Dutch approach, my wife read Simon Schama. Has a wonderful book on the Dutch. I didn't read it, but my wife read me some portions of it. And my recollection is that one of the keys to the amazing Dutch character is the fact that they all had to work together to push back the sea, and they were always in danger. If they had some real threats that were constantly there, and they would not have been the same if they were not below sea level. So I think we can. I think the Dutch system, the Dutch people, and Dutch history is very admirable. I'd be hesitant to simply apply lessons from there because they're different from the UK and the US in so many ways. But of course, that's where capitalism first developed. Holland and England, like that's this is there's something that the two cultures have in common. I don't know about proportional representation. I don't know what to say about that. But I would also just add that I believe the key to a successful democratic society is not the elections per se. It's restraints upon power, and that's true. There's a book, Why Nations Fail, and that's what they say is the key around the world. You have to have restraints upon power. And that's why Magna Carta was so important. It wasn't exactly democratic, but as long as you have constraints upon power, good things begin to happen. As for your second question, left-right thinking. I see what you mean, but I would say you can't put people into the boxes that we used to, but there is something eternal about the left-right divide. I learned this there's a wonderful intellectual historian, Jerry Mueller, and he wrote a book called Conservatism. And the introductory chapter changed my thinking. I talk about this in The Righteous Mind in chapter 12, how I found this book, read the introductory chapter in a bookstore here, and I had to sit down on the floor to take it all in, and it really changed my thinking. So here's what he says. He says, you can't define conservatism by its principles. Conservatism arises in every age as a response to the excesses of progressivism or the left, or I forget what word he uses. And so so in the French Revolution, it was, rabid egalitarianism, cut off everyone's heads, take down everybody with power. Well, so then the right, in the French Revolution was like, no, the aristocracy, they do good, the church, the clerics. So the left-right divide in France is our prototype, but that was responding to France in the 18th century. Most of us, I think what you're thinking about is labor versus capital and the rise of industrial societies, and left-right had a real meaning. And my grandfather was a labor organizer in the shoe industry in New York, as a lot of Jews were. They were, they were prone to socialism and communism. And that's what it used to be. But in the 60s, it changed. We got the new left, and now it's much more about identity issues. So I would say eternally, the left, or people whose minds are drawn towards change, diversity, new things, they're always going to overreach. They're often right. You need that progressive impulse, but they're always going to overreach and do certain things that most people think are ridiculous and oppressive. And that's what we call woke culture, is that far fringe of progressivism. And the right will eternally say that they're not just crazy, they're going to destroy everything that's good about our country. So we've got to stop them. So I would say, you show me what the extreme left is doing, and I can predict what the right looks like in your country in this decade. And so right now in Europe, I don't need to know much about any country to say, you tell me which are the parties on the left and the right, and I'll tell you what their views are on immigration. That's one of the biggest issues now for Europe. It's not as, Trump made it a big issue here, but for America, it's more about race, I think, race and other identity issues. In Europe, it's Islam and immigration. And so the left-right, the boxes change, but there's a visible temperament on one side versus the other. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, that seems reasonable, but I think you're right that the arguments around which people become tribal change over time.
Yes.
That's right. and that's why I feel that calling it right and left is kind of out of date, because that's something that originated, as you say, in the 20s, 30s, whatever it was.
Yeah.
The arguments around which people coalesce now are fundamentally different, and I don't know why we keep calling them left and right.
Well, it's better than calling them liberal and conservative. At least left and right are neutral, and what they refer to changes. But right now, at least in the United States, a lot of the left is not liberal, and a lot of the right is not conservative. So I try to use left and right because it's totally misleading to say, well, liberal and conservative are ridiculous terms now in terms of American politics. But there is still something psychological that draws people. You may have heard of this research, identical twins separated at birth. They were raised in different families. They might vote differently when they're young in their family, but as soon as they leave their families, they tend to be similar politically and religiously, because there is something about your temperament that draws you to progressivism or the reaction against progressivism. And so the anywheres versus somewheres, it might be a better term for what's going on now, especially in Britain and America, or maybe what John Hibbing was saying, securitists or something. People are totally focused on security versus people who say, no, open the borders and let people in.
I mean, if I look at myself, I would argue that I have values, a mix of values, some of which would fall into the traditional left and some of which would fall into the traditional right. And I'd hate to be put in a box.
Well, as they say, there are two kinds of people, those who think there are two kinds of people and those who don't think that. And in general, the ones who don't think that, I think, are more likely to be on the left than the right. On average, not a big effect. So yes, I'm sure many people have heterodox or mixed views. And I'm speaking here only as a social scientist looking at large data sets. You see there is something under there. There are types, but most people are somewhere in the middle or scattered.
That's it. Rory, you were jumping to get in. And then there were three interrelated questions from Wendy Main, Lewis Portal, and Charles Bollaston after you've spoken, Rory.
No, I was just going to prompt Mark Essex, who I think might have had to leave, but he has research which they conducted at KPMG, which shows something, which is that a very large proportion of the population just don't want very much to change. That you assume if you go to a small town and say, if you take another 100 houses, you can have a leisure centre. that this will obviously be considered an acceptable trade-off. What you find, and what surprised practically everybody who's metropolitan, is there's a large swathe of the population who almost in a sense don't want things to improve. I mean, it almost comes across like this because they've worked out a way to make their lives work, and they see more or less all change as disruptive, which is worth bearing in mind, because generally people in public discourse have very high levels of openness.
Yeah.
And so that surprised me, I must admit.
Yeah, that's right. So this all makes sense. I don't know if Joe Henrich's book has made it over to you. So Joe Henrich is a really brilliant anthropologist. He has a book called The Weirdest People in the World, where weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And, you know, I'm reminded of the apocryphal British headline, "Fog in Channel, Continent Cut Off." Similarly, you know, a small percentage of people on this earth are weird, and they tend to be the journalists and the professors and the, you know, intellectuals. And then they're marveling at these strange people who don't want progress. Well, actually, the great majority of people have a more conservative temperament. So I just saw data from the U.S. Even though the Republicans have lost the popular vote, many times now, Americans describe it as something like 35% say they're conservative and only 25% say that they're liberal, or whatever the number. That was about the right ratio. So most people are not weird, but most of the public discourse is conducted by weird people who don't understand the weird people. And I think that's one reason why, when there's a surprise in an election, you know, the next morning, everyone's surprised. How often is it, oh my God, the left did so much better than we expected? That doesn't really happen. It's much more, oh my God, the right did so, what kind of terrible racist nation are we? Because you know, the literati, they don't understand most people. And also most people kind of pick up that they shouldn't admit their views because they'll be called, you know, racist or homophobic or
So that was part of your insight in The Righteous Mind, wasn't it? Which is that the left tend to misunderstand or find the right more incomprehensible and vice versa.
Yes, we've got data on that. Yeah. Yeah, we tried. We gave people the Moral Foundations questionnaire, which looks at your scores on 5 of these moral foundations, and we asked a third of the people just fill it out as you normally would, and a third of them fill it out as you think a conservative would, and a third fill it out as you think a progressive would. And so we know what people's politics are, and then the question is who's able to do it accurately. And it turns out that the most accurate people are centrists or moderates, but conservatives are pretty close. Conservatives or moderates are able to fill it out in ways that pretty much match what the people who were in that category said. And conservatives were just a little bit worse. People who are liberal were worse, and people who said very liberal were really bad. So yes, for a lot of reasons, I think the people on the left often misunderstand the right. Whereas you can't grow up without hearing a lot about what the left believes, but you can easily grow up in a bubble not knowing what conservatives really think.
Fascinating. Wendy Main, are you with us?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. There were a couple of things. One, I felt, going back to social media, that part of the problem, in fact, I think the biggest part of the problem, is that people can say things online and social media because they are anonymous. They have no name to put to it. Would it help if we put a name to it? And the second thing is that I wonder if you feel that a big part of the problem is that a lot of people who are the unloved, if you like, and the misunderstood at the moment are feeling that way because they are basically feeling undervalued or not valued at all.
Yes. So on the first question about social media, I agree with the general direction you're going in. Now, first, on Facebook, almost everybody uses their real name, and on Twitter, perhaps most people use their real name. But a lot of people are on there with a fake name, and they can often be trolls. That is a real problem. One of the single biggest improvement that I can think of is that we should not allow unverified accounts. What I mean is, if you want to sign up for a Facebook account or any large platform, we're not going to force you to use your real name, but we're going to force you to at least prove that you're a real person in a particular country and that you're over 18. And so that could be done by the platform, or it could be done by a non-government organization. The platform kicks out to that there, you verify, yes, the real person. And the reason to do that, I think, is that the issue isn't just that there's not a name attached, because these platforms are used in authoritarian countries where we don't want to force people to use their real names. The problem is that anybody who wants to say terrible racist things or issue death threats, or they can do anything they want, and yeah, their account will get shut down, but they can just create 10 more tomorrow. Whereas if you at least had, at least if there was some place that knew their identity. So now if they're coordinating attacks on a synagogue or something, at least, the government or the FBI or whatever, Interpol can, at least can sometimes get the person's identity. And also they can't just go starting 5 new accounts because somebody knows who they are. So I think that, and my colleague here at NYU Stern, Vasant Dar, has a much more developed theory of this. He says, in banking, we have know your customer laws. A bank can't just take money from an anonymous person. So they have to know who their customer is. They don't have to broadcast it, but they have to know. And in the same way, Twitter and Facebook and any large platform should have to know who their advertisers are, because those are the customers, and who the users are, because they're the product. But they should at least know who they are, even if they don't say it out loud. I think that would help a lot.
Brilliant suggestions. Lewis Portal and Charles Bolliston have related questions around culture and virtue. So Lewis first.
Yeah, sure. So my question is about, first of all, thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation to sit in on. My question is about the notion of civic virtue, and you touched upon it earlier in your introduction when you mentioned honor, and George Freeman, I think, touched upon it when he mentioned his relationship, when he talked about his relationship with responsibility and taking on responsibility in society. And obviously you also spoke about it in relation to the elites, as in noblesse oblige and that kind of philosophy, I suppose. My question is, how much of the kind of polarization that exists now do you put down to a lack of a dominant concept of civic virtue?
And just before you answer that, Charles, do you want to come in with your question? Is Charles Bolliston? Maybe he's gone. So
sorry. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I had a question actually, but I was commenting with regards to Joe Zammit and his experience of proportional representation in the Netherlands, and I just put a comment out that I thought Italy had proportional representation, and so I wondered whether there was a cultural aspect as to whether this is a viable aspect or not, because it doesn't seem to work in quite the same way, it seems to me, as it does in the Netherlands. Which leads me on, if I could just expand a little bit with regards to the general left-right discussion that we seem to have. And I kind of think of the left and the right as the right is fascist and the left must be, I don't know, communist, I suppose, or something like that. And we don't seem to have a vast amount of fascist representation. Certainly in the UK, we may have a few people that speak like that. From a political point of view, we don't really have it. But we do have a substantial amount of left communist, Marxists, effectively. In fact, some of them tried to get elected as prime minister only recently. But in general, what happens from a cultural aspect is that we have always congregated in the middle. Whether it's been a Labour government, Conservative government, or whatever. And I sometimes wonder if the normal person in the street perhaps is not quite concerned with all of the aspects that we're chatting about today, because they simply have to interact and get on with their own lives. So is there really a left and right? And would proportional representation be a good thing in the UK?
Okay, yeah, I cannot speak to that. I don't understand parliamentary systems and proportional representation, so I really can't speak to that question. It surely is the case that there are cultural differences between Italy and Scandinavia and the UK, such that if you take the same parliamentary system, it's going to work very differently in the different countries. So that's again part of the complexity here. On Lewis's questions about civic virtue, yes, I think that just as there was the Pax Romana, Rome was able to administer this vast area, and people spoke of the Pax Americana for a while. I think it is good to have some sort of a cohesive central order. in the United States, in the 20th century, it was the WASP culture, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And, my grandparents, Jewish immigrants, their kids, my parents, aspired to be like them, even though the WASPs wouldn't let them into their country clubs. But otherwise, British institutions are pretty open. And David Brooks observed, I think sometime, maybe it was 2009, when Obama had his second Supreme Court appointment, David Brooks observed that despite the fact that WASPs were the dominant culture, they created an open system that let anyone succeed. And so in 2010 or so there was not a single WASP as president, vice president, in the Supreme Court anywhere, or leading either party in either House of Congress. Everybody was Jewish, Catholic, or Mormon. The only Protestant was Obama, who was Black. So I think that the WASP, having the WASP values and WASP culture, of course, people can complain about cultural hegemony, but the Jews adapted to it very well, very readily. They did not feel excluded. My wife's parents are from Korea. This is the same thing. They really aspired to that sort of American family life. So I do think there's a lot of value. And I'm going to now. So I actually have to go in 5 minutes to a meeting, and I know many of you are thinking, "What is Boris saying right now?" So you need to go. But I'm gonna sort of close here with a quote that I came across very recently from Martin Gurri, who's this really great analyst of populist uprisings. And he talks about how the amount of information in the world used to be limited and people would pay to get information. But sometime in the early 2000s, the amount of information became so vast and unlimited, now information chases people and we can't absorb it all. And he says, it used to be that people were consuming the same content. There was a common denominator to get partly at your idea. Then he says, the digital revolution, it was like we were looking into a gigantic mirror in which we saw ourselves reflected. Okay. Then he says, the digital revolution has shattered that mirror, and now the public inhabits those broken pieces of glass. So the public isn't one thing, it's highly fragmented and it's basically mutually hostile. It's mostly people yelling at each other and living in bubbles of one sort or another. So I think this is one of the problems with liberal democracy when you bring in the technology that we brought in, and for now, it's not working. Now, odds are we'll figure it out. Odds are it will work, but there's some chance that it will lead to catastrophe. So I think how's that for a context-dependent interactive note to end on?
I think absolutely fantastic, and so I think we wrap up now. There's so many other questions coming through various chat mechanisms, but Jonathan, enormous thanks for sharing all of your insights, which we'll all be internalizing, and it's so important for the Big Tent mission. We do write up all of these. We share the video with the people who've attended so they can reflect on it. And it forms then part of our plans for the regeneration mission that we have. And we'd like to reach out to all of the attendees. If there's any way you can support us in whatever way, be immensely grateful. I think what tonight has showed is just how important this is, and how Jonathan, you brought together people with really quite differing views and managed to fuse a consensus way forward. So thank you very, very much on behalf of Big Tent, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Rory. Thank you to all of you. I love thinking together about the problems we're all facing together.
Thanks very much indeed. Good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.